The entire ballroom went silent after the Duke said, "My bride's duty is to bear my children." She was holding a glass of champagne she had not yet drunk when she heard him say it. Not whispered. Not implied. Not delivered in the careful coded language that aristocrats used when they wanted to be cruel without being accountable for the cruelty. Said clearly. Deliberately. With the easy confidence of a man who had never once considered that the words coming out of his mouth might constitute an injury to the person standing 12 feet away from him. My bride's duty is to bear my children. After that I require very little else from her. 206 people heard it. The musicians heard it. The string quartet in the gallery above paused mid-note, the way musicians do when something in the room changes and continuing suddenly feels inappropriate. The servers heard it. 3 of them stopped moving simultaneously, trays held at identical angles, frozen in the specific paralysis of people who have witnessed something they will be discussing in the servants' quarters for the next decade. Lady Ashmore, standing to the left of Lord Pemberton, raised her champagne to her lips and did not drink. She simply held it there. Waiting. And Nora Ashton, the woman in question, standing 12 feet away in ivory silk and diamond earrings that had belonged to her grandmother, heard every word with the specific clarity of someone whose hearing sharpens precisely at the moment they most wish it would fail. She did not drop her glass. She did not cry. She did not turn and look at him with the expression of a woman publicly wounded. She smiled. Not a performed smile. Not the brittle social smile of a woman managing humiliation with the tools available to her. A real one, small, private, the specific smile of someone who has just received information they needed and has already decided what to do with it. 206 people saw that smile and did not understand it. They would. Just not yet. What Nora Ashton did with what she heard in that ballroom, what she built in the 3 months that followed, and what happened the night the Duke of Crestmore finally understood what he had said and who he had said it about, that is not the story you think it is. Her name was Nora Ashton. 24 years old. Only daughter of Professor Edmund Ashton, a man who had spent 40 years studying the medicinal properties of plants with the focused joy of someone who had found their exact purpose on earth and intended to use every day of it. Her father was not wealthy. He was not titled. He was not the kind of man who appeared on invitation lists or moved through drawing rooms with the practiced ease of people born to them. He was the kind of man who forgot to eat when he was working, who talked to his plants the way other men talked to their horses, who had raised his daughter in a house full of books and soil samples and the absolute unwavering belief that the purpose of an intelligent mind was to use it. Nora had inherited all of this. She was not a society woman. She had never wanted to be one. She had spent her childhood in her father's laboratory, learning the Latin names of plants before she learned to dance, understanding the properties of compounds before she understood the rules of precedence. She had opinions. She expressed them. She was, her father had always said with enormous pride, constitutionally incapable of pretending to be less than she was. This quality had made her childhood rich and her social prospects limited. It had also, entirely without her permission, attracted the attention of the Duke of Crestmore. His name was Callum Voss. 33 years old. Duke of Crestmore. One of the wealthiest men in the empire and, by the general consensus of everyone who had ever spent time in a room with him, one of the most difficult. Not cruel. That distinction mattered, and Nora had made it carefully when the arrangement was first proposed, because there was a significant difference between a man who was difficult and a man who was cruel, and she had no intention of marrying the latter. Callum Voss was difficult in the way that very intelligent men are sometimes difficult. He was precise, exacting, impatient with imprecision in others, and had organized his life around function with the specific efficiency of someone who had decided that efficiency was the same as wisdom. He had been married once before. His first wife, Elise, had died 4 years ago. Quietly, the way terrible things happen quietly in households where appearances are managed carefully. There had been no public grief, no period of visible mourning, no indication that the Duke of Crestmore had been particularly altered by the loss. Society had noted this and drawn its conclusions, that the marriage had been a practical arrangement, that warmth had not been a feature of it, that Callum Voss was a man who processed loss the way he processed everything else, efficiently and without display. What society did not know, what nobody knew except the 3 servants who had been present and had since been quietly reassigned to distant estate properties, was that Callum Voss had sat beside his wife's bed for 72 hours without sleeping while she died, and that on the morning she was gone he had walked to the window of her. Then Lord Hadley, 3 glasses of port into the evening, clapped Callum on the shoulder and said loudly enough for the nearest 30 people to hear, "Well then, Voss, what do you make of the match?" Callum turned. His glass was in his right hand. His expression was precisely the expression it always was, controlled, unreadable, efficient. He said, "Practical. My bride's duty is to bear my children. After that I require very little else from her." The musicians heard it. The servers heard it. Lady Ashmore raised her champagne and did not drink. 206 people went silent simultaneously. And Nora Ashton, standing 12 feet away in her grandmother's diamond earrings, heard every word. She smiled. Small. Private. Real. Lord Hadley, whose port had not prepared him for this particular social situation, looked between Callum and Nora with the expression of a man who has accidentally set a fire and is hoping someone else will address it. Nobody addressed it. Nora set her champagne glass on the tray of a passing server, gently, deliberately, without spilling a drop, and turned to Lady Pemberton beside her and resumed their conversation about the new botanical gardens as though nothing had happened. The room slowly, uncertainly, resumed its performance. But something had changed. 206 people had heard what the Duke thought of his bride. And 3 of them, Lady Ashmore, Evangeline Foster, and an elderly botanist named Professor Gerald Crane who had known Nora's father for 30 years, had seen that smile. And they were the 3 people in the room with enough knowledge of Nora Ashton to understand that it was not a smile of performance. It was a smile of decision. She did not confront him that night. She did not write him a letter. She did not summon him to a conversation. She did not perform injury or demand apology or signal in any way that what he had said had reached her. She went home. She sat in her father's laboratory, the familiar smell of soil and compounds and 40 years of careful work, and she thought for a very long time. Then she picked up her notebook and she wrote 3 words at the top of a clean page. What is true? She sat with that question for an hour. She was not a woman who made decisions from emotion when she could make them from evidence, and she had enough respect for the truth to apply that standard to herself as rigorously as she applied it to everything else. What was true was this. Callum Voss had said something that revealed his fundamental understanding of what she was to him. Not with cruelty, she kept coming back to that, because it mattered. He had not said it to wound her. He had said it with the easy certainty of a man who believed what he was saying was simply accurate, the way you state a fact about infrastructure. That was, in some ways, worse than cruelty. Cruelty knows it is causing harm and chooses to anyway. What Callum Voss had demonstrated was something more fundamental. He had not considered that harm was possible. He had not thought of her as someone who could be harmed by his assessment of her, because he had not fully thought of her as a person rather than a function. She was 24 years old. She had spent her entire life in a household where she was known, genuinely, specifically, with interest and attention and the consistent message that who she was mattered. She had her father's work to consider. She had the arrangement's practical necessity. And she had 3 months before the wedding. She wrote a second line in the notebook. What is possible? Then she began to make a plan. She told nobody about the plan. Not her father, he would worry. Not Evangeline, she would want to help in ways that would complicate the precision of what Nora intended. Not Lady Ashmore, who had seen the smile and who had called on Nora the following morning with the specific energy of a woman ready to be outraged on someone else's behalf. Nora had received Lady Ashmore in the sitting room and offered her tea and said, gently but absolutely clearly, I appreciate your concern. I am not injured. And I do not require assistance. What I require is to be trusted to manage this myself. Lady Ashmore had looked at her for a long moment. Then she had said, what are you going to do? Nora had smiled, the same small private smile from the night before. She had said, "I am going to let him know me." Lady Ashmore had not understood this. She had left with the expression of a woman who had expected satisfaction and received a puzzle. Nora had returned to her notebook. She called on him the following Tuesday. Not with announcement, not with social fanfare. She sent a note the morning of that said simply, "I will come at 2 o'clock. I have something I would like to show you. N. Ashton." Callum received the note in his study with the expression of a man who had not expected this and was deciding how to categorize it. He sent back a single line, "I will be available." She arrived at 2 precisely with a leather satchel and Pip, her father's terrier, 12 pounds of opinionated cream-coloured animal who had attached himself to Nora at age 3 and had not reconsidered the decision since. Callum's butler opened the door. Pip walked in first with the specific confidence of a dog who has been welcomed into enough houses to have stopped asking permission. Callum appeared in the hallway. He looked at the satchel. He looked at Pip. He looked at Nora. His expression did not change, but something behind it shifted, the fractional recalibration of a man whose expectations have been quietly contradicted. Nora said, "I have been reviewing your estate's agricultural records. The eastern farmland output has declined 17% over 3 years, and I believe I know why. I would like to show you." Callum looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Come in." They sat in his study for 2 hours. Nora spread her analysis across his desk, 3 years of yield records, soil composition data she had sourced from her father's agricultural contacts, a comparison against neighboring estates with similar land profiles. She walked him through the evidence with the focused precision of someone who had been taught that the purpose of an intelligent mind was to use it. Callum listened. Not with the performing attention of social obligation. Actually listened, the kind of listening that involves following the argument, testing it against what you know, asking the questions that identify the weak points. He asked for questions. They were the right for questions. Nora answered 3 of them completely and acknowledged honestly that the 4th required more data to answer definitively. When she finished, Callum was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How did you access the estate records?" She said, "Your steward was at my father's Botanical Society lecture last month. I introduced myself and asked if he would be willing to share yield data for academic purposes. He was obliging." Callum's jaw moved slightly. What might have been the beginning of something, not quite amusement but adjacent to it. He suppressed it. He said, "The soil analysis. You conducted this yourself?" She said, "My father's laboratory. I took samples from 3 reference points on the eastern boundary during my carriage ride here last week." Callum was very still. He said, "You stopped and took soil samples on the way to a social obligation." She said, "I stopped and took soil samples on the way to a social obligation." Something happened in his expression. Small. Almost imperceptible. The specific shift of a man who has filed something away, and not processed it yet, simply noted it for later consideration. He said, "What is the solution?" She told him. He implemented it within the week. The second Tuesday she came with a problem she had found in his household accounts, not malfeasance, simply a structural inefficiency that had been compounding for years and was costing him quietly. The third Tuesday she came with 3 years of research notes from her father's laboratory and asked if he would read them, because the funding required to complete the work would represent less than a month of his eastern estate's operating costs and would result in treatments that would genuinely help people, and she thought he should make that decision with full information rather than partial. He read them in 2 sittings and authorized the funding without comment. Then he asked her 6 questions about the research with the specific focused attention of someone who had actually read and understood what they were reading. They talked for 3 hours. The 4th Tuesday she brought nothing. She sat in the chair across from his desk and said, "I would like to ask you something." He set down his pen. He looked at her. He said, "Ask it." She said, "Your first wife. What was she like?" The room went very still. Callum's expression did the thing it did when something reached the place behind the controlled surface, a tightening that was not anger and not coldness but the specific tension of someone who has sealed something and is feeling the pressure from the other side. He said, "That is not a relevant question." Nora said, "I disagree. I think it is the most relevant question I could ask you." He said nothing. She waited. She had learned, across for Tuesdays, that Callum Voss's silences were not empty. They were full of things he was deciding whether to say, and the worst thing you could do was fill them before he reached the decision. After a long time he said, "She was kind. She wanted things I did not know how to give her. She spent for years wanting them, and I spent for years being unaware that the wanting was happening, and then she was gone and I understood, too late, that I had not seen her." Nora was very still. He said, "I do not intend to discuss this further." She said, "I know. Thank you for telling me." She left at the usual time. He sat in his study for an hour after she left and did not pick up his pen. She is not performing warmth at him. She is not managing him or softening him or executing a strategy designed to produce a specific emotional outcome. She is simply being completely, specifically, unapologetically herself, in his space, on his terms, with the steady, unhurried confidence of a woman who knows that the truth of who she is, given enough time and proximity, is impossible to overlook. She heard him say she was a function. She decided to make it impossible for him to keep believing that. Pip had decided, by the 5th Tuesday, that the Duke's study was his preferred room in the building. This was not a decision anyone had asked for his opinion on. Pip had simply arrived one Tuesday, assessed the large leather chair near the fireplace, and relocated himself to it with the decisive authority of a 12-pound animal who had never experienced a boundary he found convincing. Callum had looked at Pip in the chair. Pip had looked back at Callum with the profound and slightly accusatory attention of a dog who approved of very little and was reserving judgment on this particular situation. Callum had returned to his work without comment. By the 6th Tuesday the footman had begun placing a small water bowl near the leather chair before Nora's arrival. Nora had noted this and said nothing. But she had added it to the notebook she kept, in the column she had titled, "Without irony, without sentiment," simply because it was accurate evidence. 6 weeks before the wedding Callum did something he had not done in 4 years. He invited someone to dinner. Not a formal dinner, not a social occasion, not the kind of managed event that required staff preparation and correct seating arrangements. He sent Nora a note on a Monday that said, "If you are free on Thursday I would like you to come for dinner." Not a Tuesday. A dinner. See Voss. Nora had read the note twice. Then she had written back, "I am free. N. Ashton." She arrived on Thursday at the time specified and found the dining room set for 2 at one end of the long formal table, not opposite ends, one end, the way people sit when they want to be close enough for actual conversation rather than managed exchange across a distance that requires raising voices. Callum was already there.
And somewhere between the silence of that ballroom and the quiet rhythm of those Tuesdays, something began to change. Not all at once. Not dramatically. There was no grand apology. No sudden declaration. No sweeping moment designed to erase what he had said. Instead, there were questions. There was attention. There was a man who had spent years reducing life to function, slowly realizing that the woman sitting across from him could not be measured that way. And there was Nora. Patient, precise, unshaken, not trying to make him love her, simply refusing to let herself remain unseen.
He stood when she entered, which was the first time he had stood when she entered a room, and she noted it in the same place she had noted the water bowl. They ate dinner. It was the first time they had shared a meal, and Nora discovered, in the specific way you discover things about people when shared food removes the formal structure of a meeting, that Callum ate methodically, that he had opinions about wine that he expressed with unusual specificity, that he had read something she had mentioned 2 Tuesdays ago and had questions about it, and that when he was not performing the correct behavior of a duke at a social function but was simply sitting at a table, talking about something that interested him, his face did something entirely different from what it usually did. It became, briefly and unexpectedly, the face of someone who was actually present. Not the controlled surface. The person underneath. She saw it for approximately 40 minutes before the control reassembled itself. But she had seen it. She had added it to the column. After dinner he walked her to the entrance hall in the specific silence of two people who have had a real evening and are navigating the return to social form. At the door he said, "I have been thinking about what you said." "About Elise?" Nora was still. He said, "I was not lying when I said I did not see her. I have spent for years believing that was a failure of will. That I should have paid more attention, asked more questions, noticed more. I have recently begun to consider that it might not have been a failure of will. That I might simply have never been taught that the interior life of another person was something worth directing attention toward." He paused. He said, "I do not know what to do with that conclusion." Nora looked at him in the entrance hall light. She said, "You are directing attention toward it now." He said nothing. She said, "That is not nothing, Callum." His name. She had started using it 3 Tuesdays ago and he had not corrected her, and she had taken that as the only permission she needed. Something moved through his face. The specific movement of a closed thing opening, just slightly, in the specific way that closed things open when the pressure on both sides becomes equal. He said, "Good night, Nora." She said, "Good night." She walked to her carriage. She did not add this conversation to the evidence column. She started a new column. She titled it, "What is Becoming True?" 3 weeks before the wedding a letter arrived from Lord Dorian Ashworth. Nora recognized the name. Lord Dorian Ashworth was the man who had introduced her father to the arrangement in the first place, a social acquaintance of Callum's, a man of significant influence and the specific kind of superficial charm that required close observation to see through. The letter was addressed to Callum. Nora would not have known about it except that Mrs. Granville, the housekeeper, mentioned it in passing, not deliberately, not as intelligence, simply as part of the household communication that Nora had gradually been included in as the weeks progressed. She had learned to hear what was mentioned in passing. She went to Callum on a Tuesday, not her Tuesday, a different Tuesday, because what she needed to say could not wait. She said, "Dorian Ashworth sent you a letter last week." Callum's pen stopped moving. He looked up. She said, "I do not know what it contained. But I know that he was the architect of this arrangement, and I know that the eastern farmland I analyzed has 2 boundary parcels that directly adjoin Ashworth's estate, and I know that those parcels have been in disputed ownership for 6 years. And I know that if our marriage were to be dissolved before it produced an heir, those parcels would revert to estate litigation rather than marital property consolidation, which would benefit exactly one person." Callum was very still. He said, "How do you know about the boundary dispute?" She said, "Your steward. He is very obliging." Callum opened his desk drawer. He removed a letter. He held it out to her without speaking. She read it. Lord Dorian Ashworth had written to suggest, in the careful coded language of a man who understood deniability, that there were certain questions about Nora Ashton's suitability that Callum might wish to consider before the wedding proceeded. That her father's research, while academically interesting, had produced certain debts that made the Ashton name a financial liability. That a woman raised in a laboratory rather than society could not be expected to manage the social obligations of a duchess. That reconsideration was available and could be arranged discreetly. Nora read it twice. She folded it. She placed it on the desk. She said, "What are you going to do?" Callum said, "What do you think I should do?" She looked at him. She said, "I think you should understand why he sent it. He sent it because something has changed in the past 7 weeks that he did not calculate for when he arranged this. He arranged it believing you would remain uninterested in me as a person. That I would remain a function. That the arrangement would proceed with the specific impersonal efficiency that would make the boundary dispute resolution the most valuable outcome for everyone. He did not calculate for Tuesdays." Callum was looking at her with the full specific attention she had seen briefly at dinner, the present face, not the performed one. He said, "He did not calculate for you." She said, "No. He did not." Silence. Then Callum reached across the desk and picked up the letter. He folded it in half. He placed it in the fireplace. He watched it burn. He said, "I will be writing to Ashworth this afternoon." Nora said, "I know." He said, Nora. She looked at him. He said, I said something at the engagement reception. I have known since the following morning that I said it and that you heard it and that you have chosen not to address it directly. I would like to address it. Her hands were very still in her lap. He said, I said that your duty was to bear my children. That I required very little else from you. I said it because it was what I believed. I said it because I had organized this arrangement around function the way I had organized my entire life around function. I said it because I had not yet spent 7 Tuesdays with a woman who takes soil samples on the way to social obligations and asks the questions nobody else asks and keeps a dog in my leather chair and has made it entirely impossible for me to maintain. The belief that function is the same as wisdom. His voice was controlled. His face was not. He said, it was not true when I said it. It is even less true now. And I am sorry that I said it where you could hear. Nora was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I know it was not true when you said it. He said, how could you have known that? She said, because you said it the way people say things they have convinced themselves are true because the alternative requires more of them than they know how to give. I recognized it. I have spent my life watching my father say things are fine about his health when they are not, because the truth requires him to stop working and he would rather be wrong than stop. Callum's jaw moved. She said, I did not address it directly because addressing it directly would have produced a conversation about the statement rather than evidence against it. And I thought evidence was more persuasive. He said, it was. She said, I know. Something happened in his face. Something that was not the controlled surface and was not the brief present face from dinner but was something she had not seen before, something that looked like a man arriving somewhere after a long journey and recognizing the place. He said, I have not known how to want things since Elise. She said nothing. She let him have the space. He said, I learned to not want things as a form of protection. If you do not want anything you cannot lose anything. If you organize your life around function there is no room for the kind of wanting that can break you. He paused. He said, you have made it very difficult to not want things. Nora's heart was doing something complicated. She kept her hand still and her voice steady because this moment required honesty not performance. She said, what do you want? He stood up from behind the desk. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her and she had to tilt her head back slightly to maintain his gaze and he was looking at her with the complete undefended attention of a man who has taken down every wall and is standing in the open and has decided the exposure is worth it. He said, I want to know you. All of it. Every Tuesday and every question and everything you notice that everyone else walks past. I want the dog in my chair and the soil samples and the honest answers. I want you to keep asking me the questions nobody else asks. She said, that is considerably more than an air. He said, yes. It is. She stood up. They were very close. She said, then you should know something. I came to those Tuesdays with a notebook. I have been keeping evidence. He said, evidence of what? She said, evidence that you were a better man than you had decided to be. He was very still. She said, the water bowl for Pip. Authorizing my father's research within 48 hours of reading it. The dinner that was not a meeting. The way you listened when I talked about the farmland as though what I was saying mattered not because it was useful but because I was the one saying it. I have been collecting evidence for 7 weeks that underneath the function there is a person. And I was right. He took her face in both his hands. He said, Nora. She said, yes. He kissed her. Not carefully. Not with the managed restraint of a man performing correctly. With the specific urgent honesty of someone who has been holding something back for 7 weeks and has finally run out of reasons to keep holding it. She kissed him back with everything she had kept in the evidence column and everything in the what is becoming true column and the full weight of a woman who had decided, on the night she heard him reduce her to a function, that she was going to make it impossible for him to keep believing that. It had taken 7 weeks. She thought that was quite efficient actually. The wedding was 3 weeks later. 400 guests. Hartwell Cathedral lit with more candles than Nora had ever seen in one room. A dress that was not the ivory silk of the engagement reception but deep ivory, warmer, more deliberate, chosen by Nora herself with the specific intention of never being confused with the woman who had stood in that ballroom and smiled a private smile that nobody understood. Callum stood at the altar. He did not look at a fixed point above the officiant's shoulder. He looked at the door. He looked at it the way a man looks at a door when he is certain of what is coming through it and is simply waiting for the waiting to be over. Nora came down the aisle on her father's arm. Edmund Ashton was not a man built for cathedral ceremonies. He was most comfortable in a laboratory, but he walked with the specific upright pride of a man who knows he has raised someone worth the occasion. At the altar he placed her hand in Callum's. He said, quietly enough that only the three of them heard, "Be honest with each other. That is the only instruction I have." Callum looked at him. He said, "I will." Edmund nodded. He went to his seat. The ceremony proceeded. When the moment came for vows, Callum spoke his with the same precision he applied to everything, but there was something underneath the precision that 400 people heard even if most of them could not name it, the specific weight of a man meaning what he was saying rather than simply saying it correctly. When it was Nora's turn, she spoke clearly and without hesitation, and at the end she added something that was not in the prescribed text, because she was constitutionally incapable of limiting herself to the prescribed text when the prescribed text was insufficient. She said, "And I promise to keep asking the questions nobody else asks." 400 people looked at Callum. He looked at Nora. Something moved through his face in full view of the cathedral, not controlled, not suppressed, not the efficient management of an internal state. He smiled. A real one. Full. Unguarded. The specific smile of a man who has been found by someone who went looking specifically for him and has arrived exactly where they were always supposed to be. 400 people saw it. 3 of them had also been at the engagement reception 6 months earlier. They remembered a ballroom going silent. They remembered what Callum Voss had said. They looked at his face now and they understood, simultaneously, that the man who had said that was gone, not dramatically, not all at once, but across 7 Tuesdays and a dinner and a letter burned in a fireplace and a woman who had kept evidence of his better self until he could see it too. Gone, and replaced with someone better. Lady Ashmore leaned toward Lord Pemberton and said, quietly, "She did it." Lord Pemberton said, "Did what?" Lady Ashmore said, "Exactly what she set out to do." The wedding breakfast was everything that wedding breakfast should be and rarely are, genuinely warm. Nora moved through it with the ease of a woman who is exactly where she chose to be, which is a different thing entirely from the ease of a woman performing contentment. Pip attended. This had not been planned and had required a brief negotiation with the head footman, who had ultimately concluded that resistance was futile and arranged a small designated area near the musicians where Pip could observe proceedings without constituting a formal incident. Pip approved of the floral arrangements. He reserved judgment on the speeches. Lord Dorian Ashworth had not been invited. He had sent a congratulatory note that Callum had not opened. Nora had opened it, read it, and placed it in the evidence column under the heading, "Men Who Underestimated What They Were Dealing With." She kept that column for reference. Callum's toast was short. He was not a man who performed warmth at rooms. He stood and he looked at Nora and he said, "I made a statement 6 months ago that revealed more about my limitations than I understood at the time. I have spent the month since being corrected on the matter with a thoroughness and patience that I could not have earned and did not deserve. I am grateful. And I am, unexpectedly, entirely, with no reservation, happy." He sat down. 400 people applauded. Somewhere near the musicians, Pip barked once, short, authoritative, the specific bark of a dog who has withheld approval for long enough and has finally decided to dispense it. Nora laughed. A real one, unguarded, the specific laugh of a woman who is completely herself in the room she is in. Callum leaned toward her and said quietly, "You are the most interesting person I have ever met." She said, "I know. I was waiting for you to notice." He said, "How long were you prepared to wait?" She said, "I had projected approximately 3 more months. You came in slightly under budget." He looked at her. She looked back with the expression she had been wearing since the night of the engagement reception, clear, specific, the expression of a woman who had decided on a course of action and had seen it through with the same focused precision she applied to soil samples and estate accounts. He said, "You came to those Tuesdays with a plan." She said, "I came to those Tuesdays with evidence and a hypothesis." That is different from a plan. He said, "And was the hypothesis correct?" She said, "The hypothesis was that underneath the function there was a person worth knowing." Yes. It was correct. Outside, the spring evening moved across the Crestmore estate grounds in the specific way of light that knows it has been somewhere significant. The gardens that Nora had identified for improvement in her first week were beginning to show the results of work she had organized without announcement. The eastern farmland was recovering on schedule. Professor Edmund Ashton's laboratory had 3 new research assistants and equipment that would allow him to complete 40 years of work before his health made that impossible. And inside, in the ballroom of Hartwell House where 6 months ago an entire room had gone silent, a woman was dancing with her husband, not gracefully, because Nora had never particularly prioritized grace, and not with the performed precision of people dancing for an audience, but with the specific comfortable ease of 2 people who have decided that the other person's company is preferable to any alternative. Callum Voss had told 206 people that his bride's duty was to bear his children. He had been wrong. Her duty, the thing she had done from the moment she heard those words, the work she had brought to 7 Tuesdays and a dinner and every conversation since, was something considerably more complex and considerably more valuable. She had made it impossible for him to remain the man who had said it. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, everything. The most important thing this story says is not about Callum Voss. It is about what Nora did after she heard him. She did not perform devastation. She did not give him the satisfaction of a visible wound. She did not confront him publicly or privately or at all. She smiled. And then she went home and wrote in her notebook, "What is true?" And she applied to the problem of a man who had reduced her to a function the same focused, precise, patient intelligence she applied to everything else. She made herself impossible to overlook. Not by being louder. Not by demanding to be seen. By being so completely, specifically, unapologetically herself that continued invisibility became structurally impossible. That is not a small strategy. That is the most powerful one there is.
In the end, the most important thing wasn't that the Duke fell in love with her. It was how she responded when he failed to see her in the first place. Nora never begged to be valued, never demanded recognition, never abandoned who she was just to fit inside someone else's limited understanding of her. She simply became impossible to misunderstand. And somewhere between 7 Tuesdays, a burned letter, a dog in a leather chair, and one honest question after another, a man who once believed he only needed an heir learned that what he truly needed was her, completely, specifically, exactly as she had always been.